Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. And our special guest this week, joining us a little later on to discuss the outcome of the COP26 climate change negotiations, we'll be delighted to welcome Annika Hedberg, head of the EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe programme. As always, totally interactive discussion, questions from me to our panel, and I hope later from all of you. If you want to speak your question, as it were, click on the raised hands button, and when the time comes, I will allow you to talk and ask you to unmute yourself. Otherwise, please write your question in the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and please be as brief as possible. So let's get straight underway, and Janis, maybe I could come to you first. With a quick COVID update, because we have seen Austria become the first EU country to announce going back into a full lockdown, restrictions in a number of countries now. It's looking pretty grim in the run up to Christmas. I just wondered what your sense is this likely to be accompanied by a return to travel restrictions, or do you think the existence of the COVID digital certificate with testing, with supplementary requirements, but nevertheless a recognition of the vaccines will be enough to stave off border closures again?
Well, first of all, if you look into the situation throughout Europe, especially in not in the southeastern part of Europe, the southwestern part of Europe, sorry, where the situation is better than in other parts, but otherwise the situation is deteriorating, as you were saying, and it is with mathematical precision, because many of the epidemiologists were telling us exactly what is now happening. They were giving a sound prognosis from the second half of October. There's a good chance that the situation will worsen. And I'm saying all this because what they're also telling us that the chances are high that the situation will not substantially improve or rather deteriorate until early or maybe spring of next year. So what we're having in front of us looks rather grim. And that means that probably in a good number of countries, you will have an increasing number of restrictions. Now, Austria is the one going furthest at this present point in time. But if the numbers become worse, if hospitalization rates increase, as they're doing in a lot of countries, I think that you will see that more countries will revert to even more strict rules when it comes to how to deal with the COVID-19 situation. However, having said that, I don't think that we will go back to travel restrictions like the one which we experienced in the early phases of the COVID-19 situation. I think the fact that we have the certificate helps. The fact that we have the coordination on the certificate and that we agreed on it helps. However, having said that, I would not be surprised if certain countries introduce not only the 2G, but the 2G plus rule, that you also have to be tested in order to be able to enter a country, that there will be restrictions when it comes to the question of how long has it been gone since you had received your second jab. So for those who have overcome 6 months, there might and have not received a booster, that might create a situation where you might have restrictions. But in general, I don't think we're going back to what we had seen in previous phases.
And Fabian, we are seeing differences in the way countries are treating the unvaccinated. In some countries, a very clear attempt to say, if you are not vaccinated, the restrictions on you will be enormous, putting immense pressure. Other countries very reluctant to go down that very strong sort of divide, as it were, between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. Do you fear that will pose problems in terms of freedom of movement around Schengen? So the testing requirements might simply become too onerous for the unvaccinated?
I think firstly, I would expect that even in the countries where there's more reluctance at the moment, we are moving towards stronger regimes. Also, because the reality is that a lot of the effect we're seeing at the moment is down to a large part of the population not being unvaccinated. So if you look at, for example, numbers in intensive care, there's a predominance. I mean, it's not exclusively people who are unvaccinated, but there's a very large majority which is unvaccinated. So countries are going to take more measures to ensure that there is as strong as possible an incentive for people to get vaccinated, and that will also impact on the ability to move around. Because if you're imposing more restrictions on unvaccinated people who live in your country, then you're also imposing these on the people who are coming to your country. So I think this is inevitable.
Okay, I'm sure we'll be returning to this in subsequent updates, but let us move on now. And first of all, we've got a lot of issues to talk about this week, ladies and gentlemen, because we want to talk about what's been happening on the EU's eastern fringes. We want to talk about what's been happening to the north of the EU, namely Brexit, EU-UK relations, and we want to talk about COP26. So lots of ground to cover. Let us start with the EU's eastern border. And first of all, Belarus. There, we saw a real ratcheting up of the tensions about a week ago, and in the last few days, a marked de-escalation of tension. Janis, I'm wondering whether you read into that this is because the EU were united, were pretty forceful. The prospect of sanctions coming in seems to have persuaded. There's also been contacts between Angela Merkel and Lukashenko, between Josep Borrell and the foreign minister. What has been the trigger for the de-escalation, do you think? Because last weekend, with the Poles playing it very tough on their side of the border and Belarus seeming to continue to provoke, it looked as if we were heading for a very, very dangerous scenario.
Yes, it seemed as if that danger did exist. And I think even if we're experiencing a de-escalation now, I think we should still have in mind that potentially it could escalate again. But let me start with a remark, because if you witness the discussions which we're now having over the past week, the past 2 weeks, which has intensified, a lot of people have been talking about a migration crisis. And I think we need to be careful because the nature of what we are witnessing in front of our eyes of this crisis is nothing comparable to what we saw in 2015, 2016 in terms of the numbers. If you look at how many people have tried to cross the border to Poland, but also to Lithuania and Latvia, if you look a bit further back, but also the nature of this crisis is totally different. So we're talking about probably a geopolitical crisis involving Russia, because this is not only a crisis we're having with Belarus, and it's also obviously a humanitarian crisis with all these people being trapped, a lot of women and kids. So this is the nature of the crisis. I think we should have that in mind when we talk about it. Now, with respect to the de-escalation, I think it's a number of factors. I think actually in this case, the sanctions regimes, the increasing of sanctions, also the threat of going into further rounds of increasing sanctions has helped. I think it has helped to make sure that there is some movement on the side of Lukashenko. We see that people have been transported away from the border. We see that there have been repatriation flights of people being moved back to where they had come from. So I think that has to do with the sanctions. It has also to do with pressure on transit countries, because the scheme, how this has developed, was that people were coming from somewhere to Minsk, and then from Minsk going to the borders towards the EU. If you interrupt that, and this is something where we are as the EU heavily investing into it. Margaritsky Nas is now in Ankara. He also was in Baghdad. He was in Beirut. So there is an attempt to stop the model of how this crisis was provoked, to put it that way. I think also that Lukashenko in some ways, in some cases, overplayed his cards. For example, when he was threatening to cut the transit of gas through Belarus, and Putin openly said that that he distanced himself from that kind of thinking because it would harm also the Russian economy. And there are some who are saying that Lukashenko realized that he cannot hurt us as much as we can hurt him. I'm not sure whether he has realized that, because at the end of the day, he's fighting he's having a fight for his own political survival at home. So that is what is in the top of his head. And the question is how what we do influences that, and that I think then influences how he deals with the situation. And last but not least, even if there was a de-escalation, if you look into previous confrontations, especially geopolitical confrontation involving also Russia, we have seen the ritual of escalation, de-escalation, re-escalation. So even if the situation now looks a bit better than it did some days ago, I think we need to prepare for other phases, and that's not easy. Now, if you look at how we are also diverted when it comes to migration issues, when it comes to dealing with Russia. So that doesn't make this situation easy on our side in the long
And
run.
as you say, de-escalation, re-escalation, we have at the same time as seeing a de-escalation with Belarus, Fabian, seen an escalation again with the situation on the borders of Ukraine, that military buildup by Russia. Nobody quite sure what Putin is planning. Very strong warnings again from the French and Germans, strong warnings from the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. Also linked or not linked, the German decision to suspend the approval process for Nord Stream 2. They say it's to do with licenses and so on. But how are you reading that situation?
I think it follows on directly from what Janis was saying. We know and we have a long experience of the game which Putin is playing. And the game is about putting pressure on keeping these kind of crises on the boil. But I would say that also there's a very strong interest for that not to get out of hand, and that Putin does not want a full-scale escalation. So I think what we're going to see is a continuous pushing of the boundaries, continuous needling of the European Union and also other countries. But in the end, it is also not in Putin's interest that we get consequences such as Nord Stream 2 actually being put on ice. I think this is part also of him trying to put pressure on the European Union. And we have seen also the geopolitical game Russia has been involved in when it comes to energy prices. So this is something which we have to expect in our neighborhood and which is going to continue.
And would you expect Nord Stream 2 to be a quick shot across the bows, or something more serious? Is it? I mean, there's been a lot of pressure on Germany over this from a lot of countries. Is this a moment where we see Germany begin to turn on this issue?
I think there's a big question now with having a new government almost formed, and to see what stance this new government is going to take. In some ways, I would probably speculate that some people in the yet to be formed government would be quite glad if someone else takes this decision, because it is a difficult decision, because there are very strong economic interests in this as well, including, for example, the potential that companies might have to be compensated if this does not happen. So I think this is an issue which is on a very precarious edge, but I would still expect that what we have at the moment is really a technical hold-up. It's not going to hold it up forever.
Okay, Janis, I just want to pick up on what Fabian was saying there about Putin, because the Ukrainian foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, said this week, and I quote, "When we see migrants used as a weapon, when we see disinformation used as a weapon, when we see gas used as a weapon and soldiers and their guns, these are not separate elements, they are all parts of a broader strategy to shatter Europe." Do you think he's right? And if he is, how can the EU respond? How should it respond to this increasing challenges to the West, not just to Europe, but also to the West more generally, from the strong men, if you like, across the world?
I think that the quote of the foreign minister is a correct quote. I think it is describing in many ways what is happening. And this is, as Fabian was also saying, a situation where we will remain in limbo. This is something Putin wants. He doesn't. He wants us not knowing what actually he wants to do, because he considers this to be in his interest. So in terms of our reaction, I think it needs to be smart and decisive, while also knowing and acknowledging our limits. If you think back into what happened in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, at the end of the day, we knew that we could not, we would not go as far as to have an open military confrontation with the Russian Federation. This is something we are not able and we do not want to engage in. So there are limits to what we can do. However, having said that, we have leverage, and we especially have the economic leverage. And if you want to use your economic leverage, I think you also need to engage in diplomacy. So there has been a lot of criticism of Angela Merkel taking the phone and calling Lukashenko, as she did with respect to the geopolitical crisis, the humanitarian crisis we're witnessing in Belarus, but also in the past when people like Angela Merkel were the ones who were communicating directly with Putin, but also other strongmen in the past, Erdogan, if you remember. So I think there is this mixture of where we actually have power, also who has power in the European Union to coordinate among ourselves and to play that role, because you can see that it does work to a certain extent. However, having said that, I think we will have to live with the situation for a long time.
Fabian, quick comment from that before we move on. And was Angela Merkel right? As Janis was indicating, criticism of her, the countries in the front line, Polish, Latvia, Lithuania, all raising eyebrows at the very least at the direct contacts, seeming concerned that this might send the wrong message. Was she right to do what she did, particularly in the closing days of her chancellorship?
It is a very difficult decision to make because also, as you said, she is actually a caretaker chancellor. She's not there anymore to make long-term decisions. But on the other hand, if you have immediate questions, immediate crisis, then she still has a responsibility to react to these. I think while I would expect that people will express concern, I would think that it is the right thing to do, because in the end, some of these issues cannot be addressed unless there is some form of communication between the two sides. So the important thing for me is that, and I think this is also what the concern was about, is that the message was right. It's not necessarily that the contact in itself is a problem, but of course, if that contact also gets across a very different message, then that is an issue. So,
so it's the unity of voice that matters.
Exactly.
Just sorry, before we move on, Janis, I wanted to ask one other question, and that's about Poland. And what influence this might have. Obviously, the EU now very strongly showing solidarity with Poland, a little frustrated because it's offered help, particularly with the migration issue. Poland is saying, no, we'll deal with this ourselves. But nevertheless, suggestions of some backpedaling on rule of law issues, linking it to the other big challenge the EU is wrestling with. How do you see this? This makes Poland a very key geopolitical player right now. Will it influence, do you think, those other conversations about rule of law and other issues?
I think if you want to be realistic, and taking also into account that the issue of rule of law has reached the top level of the European Union, there have been discussions in the European Council, and now a couple of times on issues related to rule of law, whether it had to do with Poland or with the situation in Hungary also. If it has reaches that level, it also means that when you have these kind of discussions, you take into account all the other sensitive issues, and that then also includes the relationship with Russia. It includes the situation at the border with Belarus. These are things which are interlinked politically, whether you want it or not. Now, the question is whether that will lead to a substantial backtracking. I'm not sure about that, because you see that a lot of actors at national level, but also at the European level in the new German coalition, are very firm when it comes to issues of rule of law. The European Parliament is very firm on it. The spotlight is on the Commission with respect to the issue. So yes, these things are interlinked, and it would be not politically naive to think that they're not interlinked, and the Polish government is playing it out. However, having said that, I think there are limits to how far they can go.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. And talking of escalation, de-escalation, re-escalation, that probably sums up the EU-UK relationship better than anything else right now. And it looked, Fabian, a few days ago as if today we would be discussing the consequences of an imminent triggering of Article 16. Instead, here we've seen another de-escalation, apparently, a ratcheting down, talking more about exploring serious negotiations. The EU, real signals, I think the EU seems to think, coming from the UK, that they are serious now about negotiating, that whatever has happened in London, there has been a sort of a moment of truth, if you like, and a recognising that this might not be the smartest thing. Two things. Is it genuine, do you think, or is it an attempt to win the PR game before you trigger? And if it's genuine, what's caused it? Is it because the EU did play tough? They let it be known they were considering withdrawing from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The consequences were going to be much bigger than perhaps the UK had first realised. So, number one, is it genuine? And if it is, what's behind it?
I think you're asking me to speculate about what is going on in Boris Johnson's mind.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
In David Frost's mind. And the genuine answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure they know. I don't think this follows a preconceived plan. I think this is very much more haphazard, seeing where things go, seeing how far you can push things. And that also is part of the explanation of why we have seen a de-escalation, because I think there were two elements to this. There's the obvious element of what you were mentioning in terms of the EU expressing quite strongly that the UK was coming uncomfortably close to the red lines on the European side. And that if the UK was going to cross those lines, that there would be a very strong reaction to it. And in a sense, what the EU was threatening with is the nuclear option. It is to say, which was built into the TCA exactly for this kind of circumstance, but it is to say that we essentially move back to a situation of virtually no deal. And that, of course, is a significant threat. But the other thing, I think, which also happened is that for a number of different reasons, it has come back onto the agenda of some of the member states. And it has also become clear that some of the member states not only have lost any trust in what the UK is doing, but also are now at the limit of patience when it comes to dealing with this continuous provocation from the UK. And that there would be a very strong steer from the member states to the Commission that if the UK goes too far, that there will be real consequences and not just another negotiation, another attempt of resolving issues. Does that mean the threat is off the table? Absolutely not, because in the end, this is about domestic politics. It is about what Johnson can get away with at home. And we've already seen, even in the last couple of days, that, for example, within the Conservative Party, this more conciliatory tone is deeply unpopular. There are already many on the government benches which are pushing Frost and pushing Johnson to actually go further. And we shouldn't forget, sorry, I'm being a bit long, but we shouldn't forget that we have a massive corruption scandal in the UK, which is in the minds of the political actors. So a lot will depend on whether the politicians in the UK believe having more confrontation with the EU is going to help them with that corruption scandal, or whether it's going to deepen their problem.
Also, the weakening of Boris Johnson's authority means, can he risk Armageddon, if you like, a serious escalation of problems with the EU right now? Or does he say, oh, that's great, that distracts? That's the speculation side. But Fabian, before we move on, let's focus for a moment on the facts of what would actually happen. Firstly, can you explain simply, if Article 16 is triggered, what is the immediate effect of that? And if the EU were to respond by saying they were withdrawing from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, Does that simply happen months down the road as per the legalistic terms of the agreement, or could there also be short-term effects? I've seen speculation about short-term tariff imposition, retaliation. So what happens if Article 16 is triggered? What happens if the TCA is suspended?
On all of this, in many ways, we don't know, because clearly this is an unprecedented situation, and it very much depends also on the willingness of the EU to then escalate things. There could well be, and there will be also voices at that moment, which will argue the best option is to de-escalate, to depoliticize, to not get to a confrontation. But the real difficulty is that Article 16, in the end, threatens the position of Ireland in the single market. And that is the absolute red line on the EU side, because if you would necessarily have to have some controls on the land border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, then this will fuel the conflict. It will fuel the difficulties which have so far, at least they have been there, but they have not broken out completely. But if you don't have border controls and anything can just come in from Northern Ireland into the single market, we are losing the consistency of the single market. So I would expect that there will be a strong reaction. Now, what could that strong reaction be? There is the notification of the termination of the TCA that has a 12-month notice period. However, even if it has a 12-month notice period, it is the nuclear option. And if you were to trigger it, there would be immediate reactions in the markets. So it is not without consequence simply because there is a time frame. But clearly, if you are asking businesses in the UK who are importing, exporting from the European Union, in terms of their business planning, in terms of their contingency plans, they would have to immediately deal with the risk of no longer being in the single market within 12-month time. And that would have immediate consequences, because also if you're looking at planning horizons of companies, you don't have very much time. You have to take these kind of actions very quickly, so that you are then prepared after 12 months. So it would have consequences. There is the possibility also of selected tariffs, and it would be a question of exactly on what kind of products you would impose them. I think it's important here to emphasize, and that's something which in the UK has really been part of, I would almost say, the misinformation which has been there, that some people have said the withdrawal agreement is not linked to the trade and cooperation agreement. And that was one point which Šefčovič made very clear today, that actually those two belong together.
Absolutely.
But my final point, final point is also, let's not forget that this is not only about formal responses. This is also about the kind of things you can do very, very quickly. And I would just remind people that when you go back to what happened before the TCA was signed, for a relatively short period, French customs officials started to work very slowly.
Yes.
And the moment this happened, things clogged up completely on the border. So those kind of mechanisms, where you're just putting immediate pressure, are still there. And I think this is one of the fears which is stopping Article 16 at the moment, because if you can't get your turkey at Christmas, then there's going to be a political problem in the UK.
Absolutely. And I want to come to you, Janis, in a moment on the French presidential elections, but just one comment to what you were saying about the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement. Of course, a lot of speculation on the EU side that this is always what the British intended to do, because after the EU successfully said, no, first we do divorce, then we talk future relationship, that the UK went along with that, the government went along with that with a deliberate intent to then unravel the first while trying to preserve the second. Janis, I'm not going to ask you, those of us like me who actually know Boris, and I don't know him that well, but even people who know him very well say they have no idea what he's going to do. So I'm not going to ask you to speculate on that. But in terms of the EU and what the EU will do, is your sense that the EU really has reached the stage, as Fabian was indicating, where so many member states have sort of had enough of this, that they mean it when they talk tough? And how do you think the French presidential election might play into that? And then we'll move on to COP. Janis.
I will certainly not speculate about the intentions of Boris Johnson. However, yes, Fabian is right. On the EU side, there is this feeling enough is enough. And we had enough of this, and we need to showcase that we're ready to respond in a way which will be decisive in case we have to. However, having said that, I think one is that all those who still speculate that the EU27 might be divided, we have discussed that in the past, that won't happen, which also means that there's the question of how far the EU27 would go. And I think that if the Article 16 is triggered, there's a mix of different options which probably will be considered below the nuclear option. Also because you need the nuclear options in future, but plus you would have to have a unanimous agreement among the EU20 to use the nuclear option. But there is a mix of things that could be done. And Fabian was indicating them, whether that have to do with imposing some tariffs selectively, maybe even launching an arbitration procedure, withdrawing access to Horizon Europe. So there are different things that could be done and put together in a package in order to signal enough is enough while not reverting to the nuclear option. Now, in terms of the French presidential election, we're seeing that there is an increasing national tone. We're seeing that also Macron is under pressure to make sure that nobody can attack him from the right even more than they have done in the past. So if the situation escalates and we're running into the hot phase of the French election campaign, one can be rather sure that the French president will be tough, will be very tough, and will be even tougher than he had been when situations have escalated in the past, if we especially have in mind the fishery crisis.
Just a final comment. You talked about Horizon Europe. I was struck last weekend, UK government saying, we'll withdraw from Horizon Europe. If they won't let us in, we'll withdraw. And it reminded me of a sort of threat where you say, if you don't do what I want, I'll shoot myself in the foot. I didn't understand that one at all, but there we are. Let us move on before my bitterness shows through. I'm delighted to welcome Annika Hedberg to join us once again. Lovely to have you back with us. COP26, Annika, we've had the best part of a week now to assess, to look at the detail, to see what's happened. Greta Thunberg was extremely tough on world leaders during COP26. We all remember the famous blah, blah, blah quote. For you, now that, as I say, the dust has settled a little bit, you've had a chance to look at it, are you more on the side of it's blah, 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 or do you see things that we should rejoice, we should welcome? So are you glass half full or glass half empty about how we came out of it in the end?
Thank you. I'm happy to join the discussion today. I'll start with the bad news, so keeping up on the bad news side. We're not clearly on track towards achieving the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we're not on track to secure a path to achieving global net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Even if all the emission reduction commitments, so these called national determined contributions or NDCs, would be implemented, they are estimated to lead to around 2 degrees, over 2 degrees of warming. And while already 1.5 degrees temperature increase is expected to lead to notable economic, societal, and environmental costs, scientists have given us a very stern warning that if we can't keep to this limit, with higher temperature increases, the speed and the scale of the negative impacts would increase exponentially. So taking this urgency, taking the scale of the challenge, as well as the expected costs for generations of today, as well as tomorrow, what we have on the paper is not enough. But there are things that we can be positive about that give us hope. And we did make progress on several important issues. On cutting emissions, the Glasgow Climate Pact instructs countries to come back in 2022 with strengthened emission reduction commitments. It's positive that countries actually agreed that the NDCs are not in line with the 1.5 degrees pathway and agreed to strengthen them over the next year, as this still gives the hope that we could keep the 1.5 degrees within our reach. As another positive thing, we saw huge attention paid to the need to end coal-fired power. And the agreement includes the first ever reference to the role of fossil fuels in climate crisis, the need to phase down coal, as well as inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. As a third positive thing, I would say that on a political level, the US-China climate announcement, I think, was very important in signaling that these two major countries see the need to address climate crisis as something so important that despite their all other major differences, they are interested to work together on climate action. And as a political signal, I think it's an important one.
You mentioned, Annika, if I could just follow up on that, the
Right.
phase down of coal. It was supposed to say phase out of coal. And we saw the chair of the negotiations, Alok Sharma, almost in tears on the last day because of this last minute deal between the US and China that came up with that new wording. But then we saw Boris Johnson saying, no, it's still a tipping point. We have the acknowledgement, as you said, that this needs to happen. And although the wording isn't as strong, this is the moment of truth, as it were. Where are you on that? Was it a tipping point? How significant was the watering down from, was Alok Sharma just very tired and therefore disappointed he didn't get everything he wanted? Or was there a genuine reason that we should all weep because of that change in wording?
I think it's worth to say that it was obviously unfortunate that there was this watering down, and it's India was very strong that they wanted to change the coal from phase out the use of coal to phase down. Some see it as a clause that would now allow continued use of coal, but there are also others that suggest that still this framing sends a signal that the era of coal is ending. And I would say that it is significant and that for the first time, a COP text actually mentions fossil fuels. And whether we're talking about phase out or phase down, I have to say that as long as there's no date for this, this can actually hamper a slowdown action. But on the kind of rhetorical level, the fact that it is mentioned, I think that it sends an important signal.
Come back on some of that in a moment, but Janis, Fabian, your overall assessment, it was a tipping point, it was significant, we have made progress, we should cheer more than we should weep. Janis, where are you on that spectrum?
I'm happy to see that Annika is not so negative, because if you see what happened in Glasgow, and you look into the actual challenge we're having in front of us, we should do the extra mile while we're talking about centimeters and millimeters. Now, having said that, what's the alternative? So when Annika was rightly describing what the achievements are, and she was listing some of them, and even the phasing down instead of phasing out, if you look at them combined, and if you have in view that this is a long-term process, which will have to continue and does continue, we are progressing. There is some progress. But the question is, and that's where Annika began with, is it enough? Is it enough to limit global warming to 1.5? Or actually, are we not on the way to 2.0 or maybe even more? So it is extremely difficult to make, a realistic assessment of what has happened if you don't take into account what your starting point is. What is the level of ambition? So the blah, blah, blah is correct. But saying also, and if you talk to people who have been following the COP process for decades now, they will be telling you this is how the process works. It is moving very gradually, very slowly in the right direction. And yes, always not doing enough, but still moving in the right direction. So it is extremely difficult. But I personally must say that the expectations were low, and unfortunately, Glasgow fulfilled low expectations, but their frustration remains very high.
Thank you. Fabian, from your point of view, tipping point or too little too late?
I mean, I think this is a bit, you can look at this glass half empty or glass half full. Yes, there are elements which are very positive, and there are elements which are very worrying. But whether you agree that it's half empty or half full, it's not enough. And I think that is the fundamental issue, which we also should be more honest about. And I think for some of the world leaders to afterwards try to overemphasize the positives. I think, yes, we should recognize that we have achieved something, but we also have to recognize that we're nowhere near where we should be. And the big challenge, which I think we are facing here, and I would also say that even the more, if you like, progressive countries, the European Union, haven't really faced up to this, is the question of systemic change. That what we are ultimately talking about is still far too much trying to turn the dial a little bit, trying to turn down some things. And I do think that the coal wording is a very significant one, because if you're just phasing something down, that gives you any time in the world to do it. And you can always argue, as long as it's a little bit less, you're on the right path. And this is part of the problem. We have been arguing for far too long that, okay, we might not be making enough progress, but we are in the right direction. But we're running out of time now. It is getting too late to make the progress which is needed. And we need to get to the point where we really have a discussion about systemic change and how we can completely do things differently and not just operate at the edges. So it's not just blah, blah, but much more is needed.
Yeah, and Annika, I know you want to come in, and linking this to what you said earlier about there was this commitment to come back with commitments to get to 1.5. Ursula von der Leyen said we need to make sure Egypt puts us firmly on track for 1.5 degrees. But based on what you've seen and what you saw, your reaction to Fabian's point about it is too little, too late at this point, and based on what you've seen, how confident would you be that when we get to the next COP in Egypt, they will come back and have genuinely firm commitments to get there, based on what we've seen over the last couple of weeks?
I really want to stress here is that I think that we have a tendency to look at COP and what happens at COP.
Yeah.
But as previously also, and now in the aftermath of COP26, its success will actually greatly depend on what happens now. Yeah. It's the COP provided our leaders yet again a chance to come together to discuss needed measures, but the actual work is done elsewhere. And there were actually a number of other commitments and initiatives that were launched at COP, which also need to be followed up. So the words need to be turned into action if we actually are to deliver on the Glasgow promises. And what we saw that the COP provided yet again another reminder of the urgency of action. And ultimately, there's nothing stopping countries to do more. So I think that that's also important to keep in mind, that the COP is not the only place where action is taken.
But it is where the big political signal gets sent.
Indeed, indeed. And that's when we're talking about the next COP, and indeed there is this question, okay, where are we now or where are we heading? It is actually very important what happens now in the next year. So the countries themselves have agreed that they will come back with strengthened commitments, and a lot depends now on how much pressure can be applied to governments in 2022 to keep the 1.5 degrees alive. I have to say that I find that the COP26 COP27 will be, they are talk shops, and the actual work is done elsewhere. And we do see real recognition for the urgency of action. We see several very important commitments and initiatives that now need to be followed up. But globally, as well as in the EU, key is what will happen. Will these pretty Sunday speeches and declarations we hear, will these actually be turned into action on Monday? And this is obviously, eyes are also on the EU, what actually in practice does happen here.
I want to come back on the EU in a moment, but Janis, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I think the point which Annika raised is perfectly correct. COP26 is not the moment, the decisive moment, as previous COP and future COPs won't be. However, And that's where I think a problem is coming in if you look into the future. As also the so-called front runners, and the EU is considering, and the EU member states are considering to themselves to be front runners, as they are in the process of implementing the Green Deal, but also implementing things at the national level, and run into opposition. If when you actually translate, taking up Annika's words about Sunday speeches and Monday's reality, when you move from Sunday to Monday, and you will see that it becomes increasingly difficult to implement things at the national level. What does that mean for the next COP in Egypt and thereafter? There is a danger that it might become even more difficult. And already countries which are suffering and will be suffering from climate change more than others are losing trust in those who are portraying themselves as frontrunners. So if actually we see that we're not able to implement, that will send negative signals towards other players. Plus, and I think if you look at what happened on Friday and Saturday in Glasgow, and this game in certain ways, which happened between the US, the EU, and China and India on the other side, it was also about sending signals which had nothing to do with climate. These were political games, also directed towards internal consumption at home. And if you look into how potentially the situation can deteriorate between Beijing and Washington, D.C. in future, what does that mean with respect to climate initiatives for climate momentum in future? So if you look into that broader picture, unfortunately, the situation looks not better, but rather worse.
Let's come to the EU's role in all of this. And I have two questions about that. The first is about the role that the EU played in the negotiations. There have been criticisms. I don't know whether they're justified or not. I've not been close enough to the action, but the EU really was not playing the leadership role that it claims for itself on the ground at the COP26. Annika, I don't know, is that true? Is that not? Is it fair? And then we'll come to what this means for EU policies. But the EU's role in the negotiations, how much of a player were we?
I think, first of all, I think we should be realistic. What are the dynamics and responsibilities at COP? First of all, obviously, UK had the presidency. It was their responsibility to lead the negotiations. I think it's also worth to recognize that the US back to the game, it all naturally got a lot of attention. So this may have put the EU in a bit of a shadow in comparison. But this said, the EU still was visible and played an important role. From the EU side, we saw that Vice President Timmermans very much took the limelight and played a dominant role in the discussions as well. On the EU role, I think that it's worth to recognize that, for example, let's take the global methane pledge. EU was driving this initiative together with the US. And in the end, more than 100 countries have now agreed to cut their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. This is huge, as methane is a significant driver for climate change. But where I would say that where the EU can be judged is on the gap between rhetoric and action, what the EU says and does, and the EU, frankly, is at times seen as being very two-faced. Yes. If we jump into the shoes of developing poor countries that are most vulnerable in face of climate crisis and have been paying a high cost already for years for this, one can understand their disappointment, even anger, when they see the EU and the rest of the developed world that have historical responsibility for climate crisis trying to hide away from this responsibility, as is seen in the discussions on loss and damage. The EU and the rest of the developed world have failed to meet their commitment to deliver $100 billion annually to the developed world starting in 2020. And at the same time, these same countries continue to pay hundreds of billions in subsidies for fossil fuels. So you can clearly understand that there is disappointment and anger and looking at what is being said and what is done.
Absolutely.
And so maybe just I can just say that now globally, as well as within the EU, this gap between the ambition and action as it remains wide, this is something that we need to look at very carefully. We unfortunately see that often countries don't follow through on their promises to limit climate change, support developing countries that struggle to deal with the consequences of climate crisis. And I have to say, the EU still remains one of the largest subsidizers of fossil fuels in the world. So these are issues that we do need to.
I wanted to ask, but I want to bring Fabian in first. What does this mean? For example, we talked about the significance of phase down, phase out what does this mean for the EU's own actions and for implementation of the Green Deal? But Fabian, you wanted to come in.
Just one quick word on Egypt. I think what worries me is it sounds a bit like what we were already saying about Glasgow. And we continue to just push it into the future and to say, but next time, really, we will do it. As we've already said, we're running out of time. But I think in terms of also the negotiation dynamics, I think there were two factors which also limited the effectiveness of Europe in these negotiations. One was the ongoing conflict, and I'm sorry I have to come back to that, but the ongoing conflict with the UK. Yep. What we did not have is a strategic agreement between the Western Alliance, whatever you want to call it, on how we would approach this. And I think that was a major shortcoming. I don't think it would have solved everything, but it would have made it much more effective. And we saw the role a presidency could play with Paris, that if you have that kind of united approach, it can be very effective. The second problem, I think in some sense was unavoidable, but it is that we still don't have a German government. It would have been better from that perspective, to have COP26 in 6 months' time, because I think the German government might well have had a different approach, a more decisive approach. I think, yes, they were present. Of course, they were also supporting it, but it's not the same thing if you have a caretaker government. And particularly, there is quite a strong climate protection theme running through the new government. So in that sense, maybe that is a little bit of a positive thing to consider. Maybe let's see what this government will actually want to take forward, and also what that might mean for the things we're doing at the European level. And as Annika rightly says, it very much depends on what we do now. So that is an opportunity as well.
Absolutely. So Annika, we have that situation with Germany, a new government, and Fabian was outlining there how significant that could be. How do you read the translation of COP26 into EU policies, into programs? Does it make a significant difference to what was already planned? Does, for example, the phase down versus the phase out strengthen the arms of those who are in this post-COVID phase, trying maybe to weaken some of the commitments that have been made to greening our economies? How do you see the political and practical interplay of the two things?
I'll come back to that, but I'll just mention just one thing about the ambition in Glasgow with regard to the NDCs. And I think that's, I'm being actually try to be quite politically realistic here. I think that there were a lot of people who hoped that the NDCs would have been strengthened in Glasgow to be in line with the 1.5 degree ambition. But this was not very realistic politically. The NDCs are often outcomes of very difficult domestic political processes, and with pretty much all major countries having announced their NDCs before COP26, they were not going to revise them in time for Glasgow or in Glasgow. So that's why I'm still hopeful that the countries have now a possibility to go back to their commitments and hopefully strengthen them. So want to say that positive note in there.
Absolutely.
But just to say on now the linkages with the Green Deal. So I think that overall, obviously, ambition level should be much higher. We should be seeing much more action. But I do think that when we're looking at the international momentum for action, we saw at COP, we see outside the COP, we see the pressure from young people, from civil society, as well as the interest of business to contribute in action. It means that the pressure is on. It's on globally, on countries, it's on our leaders, it's on policymakers, and this is obviously reflected also in the EU. So I keep on saying always the race to the top has started, and the EU is not the only global actor that is using its policies, financing and other tools to try to become more sustainable. And the global competition, it's on for leadership, it's on for ideas or for sustainable solutions. And as this competition is growing, this is actually the point in time when the EU has a chance to actually try to compete on this market. And it really cannot afford to wait and lose this opportunity. And it's from that perspective, the Green Deal is ever more important, and that the drive to actually get on track is there. I could also add one specific example where I think that actually the discussions in COP provide a very interesting global context for action within the EU. At COP26, more than 100 countries signed an agreement to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. So there's a global recognition and also political support that more must be done. So you could say that arguably this makes it easier for the EU now to take measures in support of deforestation, also when they have impacts beyond its borders. And as a result, you could argue that European Commission's proposal this week on tackling deforestation, which will have impacts beyond its borders, as it will try to ensure that our imports of beef, soy for animal feed, palm oil, coffee, cocoa, etc., they have not contributed to deforestation. So arguably, because of these developments and agreement at the COP26, we should have strong international support now for the measures we hope to take.
And as you say, another example there, you mentioned methane earlier, these other agreements, these other alliances that have been formed on specific issues, almost as important as what happened in the main venue. Janis and Fabian, a final thought in terms of that link between what happened at COP and what happens in the negotiations on details of the Green Deal in Europe. Janis.
I think that from a logical perspective, Annika is right. The pressure is increasing. There are also other players which are on the, what you call it, race to the top. Yes, and that pressure is there. And there's also, by the way, an opportunity for the EU to take up and actually deliver on some of its promises. Having said that, if you look at the national level and you open the black box of 27, you will see how difficult this is, how difficult it is within individual member states when you actually need to translate things into action. The discussions you're now having in Germany, as an example, where you will have a Green participation, but the Green Party only received 15%. And already a lot of people in Germany, in the German political discourse, being unhappy about what seems to be the outcome of the coalition talks when it comes to the level of ambition of turning the green transition into reality in Germany. So I'm just mentioning this example because if you look into the actual opportunities that are there and you look into the actual situation on the ground in different member states, and I didn't give an example which was now related to the current Polish government or to others who are much more negative when it comes to achieving progress. I was taking an example of someone who we consider to hopefully be a front rider in future. That shows you how difficult it will be.
Final thought, Fabian, please.
I don't want to add to what has already been said by Janis and Annika. I agree with that. Just one thought, I think, which is important, that we also look at the external dimension of these policies and that we consider how this is now going to impact. And I think there's a real question, for example, when we're talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which we are going to have to move in a direction where these kind of measures are on the table, because otherwise we cannot address it. So one question for me is, in the follow-up of COP and in the implementation of the Green Deal, when we are starting to implement such measures which have an impact on our external economic relations, what is the reaction of the rest of the world going to be to that? How acceptable is it going to be to others that these actions take place? And there might well be significant political conflict also to come on that front, again putting into question the implementation of what we are trying to achieve.
And on that note, thank you very much. Covered an enormous amount of ground in less than 60 minutes. So thank you, and particularly thank you to Annika. You've been watching it. I imagine you've had more sleepless nights over the last few weeks, the most, following every twist and turn. And we're really grateful to you for joining us today. I bet you're glad the weekend is here. Ladies and gentlemen, it only remains for me, again, to thank all three of them. Thank Fabian, thank Janis, Annika. just to mention a couple of things coming up next week. On Monday, Conference Conversations, which I will have the privilege of moderating our next episode in that series, taking stock of progress in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And we'll have with us Dubrava Suica, the co-chair of the executive board of the conference, and of course, European Commission Vice President for Democracy. And coming up, linked to our conversation earlier about Brexit, on Tuesday, November the 30th, the future of European integration. What lessons to draw from Brexit? I'm intrigued by the very title of that one. So thank you all very much for being with us today. And it only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant, even if it is a bit of a damp, grey winter weekend. Thank you and goodbye.